50 years. The water has been flowing for 50 years. I know because I was there the morning it started, and I have been here every morning since watching it come out of the hillside the way it always comes steady and cold and completely indifferent to everything that happened to produce it. 50 years of drought, years and flood years, and the ordinary years in between that nobody talks about because ordinary years don't make stories. 50 years of children who were born after the tunnel was dug and have never known what it means to be thirsty in the way their parents were thirsty. 50 years of the water just doing what water does when you finally give it a way out. I am 71 years old. My hands look like the hands of someone who spent 3 years inside a mountain, which is what they are. The scars on my palms have gone smooth with age, the way all scars eventually go smooth, but the shape of them is still there if you know how to look. My granddaughter traced them once with her finger and asked me how I got them, and I told her I built something. She asked what? I said a path. She asked where the path went. I said to water. That satisfied her. Children understand more than we give them credit for. The story I want to tell you is not a simple one. It starts in 1887 in a valley in the Arizona territory that had been dying by degrees for 2 years. Before it knew it was dying, the way a man who is very sick sometimes doesn't understand what is happening to him until the sickness has already taken most of what it came for. It starts with a well going dry and a woman who smiled when it happened. It starts with a girl of 18 who had nothing left in the world except 40 acres of rock and a promise her dead grandmother had made to her dead mother and that her dead mother had made to her. It starts as most things in my life have started underground. But to get there, I have to take you back to the beginning. And the beginning for me was not the morning I started digging. The beginning was a morning 3 years before that when I was 15 years old, and my mother's hand went still in mine, and the only sound in the room was the wind coming under the door of the adobe and the distant call of a hawk somewhere out over the desert hunting. Dry Wash Valley, Arizona territory. The summer of 1884. The valley had been named with the particular bleak honesty of people who understood exactly what they were dealing with for the wash that ran through its center, a wide sandy channel that carried water maybe 8 weeks of the year during the monsoon season, when the storms came up from the south and dropped everything they were carrying on the high desert all at once. The rest of the year, the wash was bone dry, cracked white as old pottery, looking like the ghost of the thing it became in August. The settlers who had come here in the 1850s and 1860s had known what they were getting into. They had chosen it anyway the way people choose difficult things, when the alternative is something they can't live with either. My grandmother Ruth Vance had been among the first. She came with her husband Elias in 1851 with 2 mules a wagon and the particular determination of a woman who had decided exactly what she wanted from the land and was prepared to work until she got it or died trying. She did not die trying, but she did not fully get what she wanted either. And the distance between those two outcomes was the distance of a story I would not fully understand until I was standing in the dark inside a mountain with my hands wrapped around a piece of iron she had touched 40 years before I was born. What Ruth wanted was water. Real water. Not the monsoon water that came and went too fast to be relied on, not the tepid mineral-heavy water from the valley wells that gave out every few years and had to be redug in new locations. Real water. The kind that came from somewhere deep and ran cold and clear and did not stop just because the sky stopped cooperating. She knew it was there. This is the thing people found difficult to accept, and the thing I understand completely, because I have held her journal in my hands, and I have read what she wrote, and I know what it feels like to be certain of something that the rest of the world cannot see. Ruth Vance was not a woman given to fantasy or superstition. She was methodical and observant, and she kept records of everything: rainfall, temperature, the behavior of the cattle in different seasons, the way the ground shifted and settled in the cold months. Her journals were the notebooks of someone paying very careful attention to the world around her, not the journals of someone who had decided what the world contained before she looked at it. And what she found one afternoon in the late summer of 1853 was a hollow at the base of the mesa on the eastern edge of her property, where the air that came out of the rock was different from the air everywhere else. She wrote about it in the third journal in the careful, evenly spaced handwriting she used when she was recording something she wanted to be certain about. The temperature at the base of the East Formation holds at 55 degrees even on the worst days of August, when the rest of the valley floor is baking at over 100. This is not the ordinary coolness of shade. This is something coming from inside the rock. I have measured it at 3 different times of day, and the measurement does not change. I have been in the mines in Pennsylvania when I was a girl, and I know what the temperature of deep stone feels like. This is that. This is the Earth's own temperature, the constant the miners talk about, the 55 degrees that holds at depth, regardless of what the sky does above. The Earth is trying to tell me something. I believe there is water beneath this formation, and I intend to find it. She wrote that in 1853. I did not read it until 1887. The 34 years between those two dates were filled with a history I can only reconstruct in pieces, from the later journals, from things my mother told me, from what Amos Crowfoot eventually shared with me, in the slow, deliberate way he shared everything, as though time were something he had in abundance, and saw no reason to waste by hurrying. What I know is this: Ruth began digging in 1853. She dug for 2 years, learning as she went, making mistakes and correcting them, working with a focus that the people around her found either admirable or alarming, and depending on their temperament. By 1855, she had a tunnel that went 112 feet into the mesa, at the angle she believed was correct, angling down on a slope that would allow water to flow out on its own if she reached it. And then the men came. I don't know all the details of what happened that day. Ruth's journals stop abruptly in mid-sentence on October 3rd, 1855, and don't resume for 6 months, and when they do resume, she writes only about practical matters: the cattle, the rainfall, Elias's health, with none of the careful scientific observation that had characterized her earlier entries. The woman who comes back to the journals 6 months later is writing with the handwriting of someone who is being deliberate about what she does and does not record. What I know pieced together from the one thing she did write down is this: the Holcroft family, who had arrived in the valley in 1854 and who had established the only reliable well on the valley floor within 2 years of their arrival, saw in Ruth's tunnel an existential threat. If Ruth found water, real water, deep water, the kind that didn't depend on the rains, the Holcroft monopoly on the valley's water supply would be finished. And the Holcrofts were not the kind of people who allowed their monopoly to be finished. The last entry in the notebook before the 6-month silence was this: they came today and took the map. I will not write more. 6 words. The whole history of what happened compressed into 6 words in a period placed at the end of them, with the pressure of someone pressing down very hard on something that would otherwise come apart. This is where I have to tell you about Adelaide Holcroft, because you cannot understand the rest of this story without understanding her, and you cannot understand her without understanding the inheritance she was carrying, the money and the wells and the ranch. Yes, but also the knowledge of what her father had done and why, and what it had meant for the valley and the people in it. Adelaide Holcroft née Crane was 55 years old in 1887. She had been widowed for a decade, her husband having died of pneumonia in 1877, and left her in sole command of the largest water operation in Drywash Valley. She was not a villain in the way that stories sometimes manufacture villains. She was not cruel for the sake of cruelty, was not indifferent to the suffering around her, did not take pleasure in the mechanics of the thing the way a simple monster would. She was something more complicated and in some ways more difficult than a simple villain. She was a woman who had been taught from her earliest years that a certain arrangement of the world was natural and right, and who had organized her entire life around maintaining that arrangement, and who had chosen every single day not to look at what was underneath it. Her father, Corbin Crane, had come to Arizona Territory in 1854 with a surveyor and a lawyer in that order, and had identified the best well site in the valley within his first week. He had the well dug, the water rights registered, and the surrounding land purchased before most of the other settlers understood what was happening. By 1856, he controlled every reliable water source within 12 miles of the valley center. By 1860, the families who had settled here before him were paying him for access to water they had believed was a common resource. Adelaide had grown up understanding this as simply the way things were. Her father provided a necessary service. The settlers needed water. He had the water. That was commerce. That was the valley. What her father had told her on an evening when she was perhaps 10 or 11 years old, sitting on the porch of the Crane Ranch in the last of the day's light, was something slightly different. He had told her about a woman named Ruth Vance, a stubborn woman, he said, with the particular dismissiveness of a man who uses the word stubborn to mean a woman who refused to accept his version of events. He said Ruth Vance had been digging into the East Mesa, trying to find water where there wasn't any, convinced she could break his hold on the valley if she could just get through enough rock. And he had gone out there with 3 men and persuaded her to stop. He said the word persuaded. He was talking to his daughter. There are things you don't say to your daughter, but Adelaide was not a foolish woman. She knew what persuaded meant when her father used it, and she knew what the look on his face meant when he told this story, not pride exactly, but the particular satisfaction of a man who had protected something important by whatever means were necessary and had decided that the means were justified by the importance of the thing. Adelaide did not ask questions. She never asked questions about the Vance woman or the tunnel or what exactly had happened on that October day in 1855. She understood the way that children of powerful men sometimes understand that the not asking was part of what was expected of her. That knowledge was a gift to be managed, not shared. She grew up, she inherited. She ran the water operation with the efficiency of someone who had been trained for it since childhood. And she did not think about Ruth Vance or the tunnel in the East Mesa or the water that might or might not be somewhere in the rock beneath it. Not until the summer of 1887, when a girl of 18 came into her office with the look of someone who had found something they weren't supposed to find and asked about the status of a contract that Corbin Crane had drawn up 32 years before. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The summer of 1884 was the summer my parents died, and I want to tell you about it plainly without the kind of language that turns grief into performance. Because what happened was not a performance, and the grief was not the kind that benefits from decoration. My father, Jonas Vance, died on a Tuesday in July of the fever that was moving through the territory, that season taking people in the particular indiscriminate way that fevers take people, the young, the old, the healthy, the already weakened, with no apparent preference or system. He was 39 years old. He had worked the land on the east slope of the valley for his entire adult life, had coaxed crops out of ground that most people would have looked at and walked away from, had maintained the adobe and the water storage and the 2 small corrals with the quiet thoroughness of a man who understood that the work was never finished and had decided to be at peace with that. My mother, Clara, lasted 4 more days. I think she did not so much die of the fever as die of my father, the fever having created the opening and her grief having walked through it. I was with her at the end. I was 15 years old, and I held her hand, and I told her things I believed and some things I did not believe, but said anyway because she needed to hear them, which is a different kind of truth, but still a kind of truth. She said something to me before she closed her eyes for the last time. Her voice was barely more than the shape of words, just enough sound to carry them. The water is there, Nora. Under the mesa. Your grandmother knew. Find it. She was the 3rd generation of women in my family to say those words. Her mother had said them to her, and her grandmother had said them to her mother. And somewhere back at the beginning, Ruth Vance had said them to herself on an afternoon when she pressed her hand to the rock and felt 55 degrees rising up from somewhere deep in the earth and understood what that meant. I held my mother's hand until the sound of the hawk outside the window told me the morning was getting on, and there were things that needed doing, and then I went out into the Arizona light and stood in the dry heat and looked at the East Mesa and felt nothing very specific except the particular emptiness that follows when the last person who belongs to you has left. I was 15 years old. I had 40 acres of rock and a debt that I would spend the next 3 years slowly discovering the full dimensions of. I had 2 mules of plow that needed repair and a house that leaked when it rained, which was not often. I had my father's tools in the shed and my mother's kitchen things and a Bible on the shelf that had belonged to my grandmother, and I had 3 years of whatever life demanded of me before I was old enough to do what I had started to understand I was going to have to do. I did not cry for very long. Crying was a luxury, I noted, the way you note things that other people have that you cannot afford, and then I went about the business of surviving. The 3 years between my parents' deaths and the morning I started digging were the years that made me into whatever I was by the time I finished. I was not the same person at 18 who had stood in the sun at 15 and listened to a hawk and felt empty. The emptiness had been filled the way emptiness gets filled when you have no choice but to keep moving, not with happiness exactly, but with something more durable, with purpose maybe, with the particular steadiness that comes from deciding what you are doing and why, and then doing it every day, regardless of whether it is comfortable or convenient or recognized by anyone who might care. I learned to manage the land. I learned which parts of the 40 acres would yield something in a good year and which would yield nothing in any year and should be left to the desert that wanted them back. I learned the rhythms of the animals, the 2 mules, a small herd of goats that I kept for their milk and their adaptability to the rocky terrain, 4 chickens that seemed to operate on a set of principles entirely their own. I learned to make things last. I learned to need less than I thought I needed, which is one of the most useful things a person can learn and one of the least pleasant. I paid the most immediate debts. Not all of them, there were more debts than I initially understood accumulated over years of drought and bad seasons and the particular financial pressure of paying Adelaide Holcroft for water every week. But I paid enough to keep the land from being taken out from under me in those first years, and I found work where I could find it mending harness leather for the livery in town, helping with the grain harvest on the Prescott property 2 miles north when the season came, taking on whatever was available, and doing it well enough that people remembered to come back. And every evening after the work was done and the animals were settled and the adobe had gone dark with the cooling of the desert night, I read my grandmother's journals. I had found them in the first week. I was cleaning the adobe, a necessary task after 3 years of my parents' final illness, in the disorder that illness creates in a household. And I had been working in the back room, which had been my grandmother's room before she died and had been used for storage since, and I had been moving the old dresser to clean behind it when I felt the resistance in the wall. Not a structural resistance, not the resistance of plaster or adobe block. Something else, or a slight unevenness in the surface of the wall that my hand noticed before my eyes did because my hand was in contact with it and my eyes were focused on the dresser. I set the dresser aside and looked at the wall. There was nothing visible. The adobe surface was smooth in the color of old cream, the same color it had always been, undistinguished from the rest of the walls in any way I could see. But when I pressed my hand flat against it and moved slowly, there was a section perhaps 2 feet wide and 18 inches high where the atom had a different quality, harder at the edges, slightly hollow sounding when I tapped it in the way that a wall tapped over empty space sounds different from a wall tapped over solid fill. It took me the better part of an hour to work the section free without damaging it. The adobe had been carefully fitted back into the opening and sealed with a clay mixture that had dried to nearly the same color as the surrounding wall. Someone had done this deliberately with skill in a way that was meant to look like nothing. Behind it was a wooden box roughly made from packing crate lumber, sealed with a leather latch. Inside the box were 6 journals and a Bible. I sat down on the floor of the back room in the fading afternoon light, and I opened the first journal, and I began to read my grandmother's handwriting for the first time in my life. I want to be precise about what Ruth's journals were because I think precision matters here. They were not romantic documents. They were not the outpourings of a woman consumed by a dream. They were working documents, field notes, essentially from someone who was conducting a systematic investigation and documenting her findings with the care of someone who understood that the documentation might matter to someone else later. The early journals were primarily about the land itself, the behavior of the soil in different seasons, the way the groundwater moved or didn't in response to rainfall, the patterns of plant growth in different areas of the property and what those patterns suggested about what was underneath. Ruth had an understanding of these things that she had arrived at by observation and inference, and what I can only describe as an intimate attention to the land she lived on, the kind of attention that requires years of looking at the same ground from different angles and different lights at different times of year until you start to understand what it is actually saying. The 55 degrees appeared first in the 3rd journal, as I have described, but it was not the last time she wrote about it. She returned to it again and again over the following 2 years, checking it in different seasons, comparing it to the temperature of the ground 20 feet away, trying to understand exactly what it meant and exactly where the source was. I have visited the hollow at least 30 times now, she wrote in the 4th journal, and the temperature has never varied by more than half a degree. This is significant. Ordinary ground at the surface level follows the weather. It is warm when the weather is warm and cold when the weather is cold. Only ground that is connected to something at a depth maintains this kind of stability. I believe the hollow is positioned above a fissure or channel in the rock that connects to a water-bearing formation considerably below the surface. The temperature of 55 degrees Fahrenheit is consistent with what geologists describe as the mean annual temperature of the Earth at depth in this region. This is not surface water. This is something much older and much larger. She had mapped the hollow and the surrounding terrain in careful detail. The angle of approach, the likely direction of the underlying water channel based on the topography above, and the slight asymmetry in how the temperature distributed across the hollow floor. The depth she estimated would be necessary based on her mining knowledge from Pennsylvania. She had done everything except dig the tunnel itself, and then she had dug that too, 112 feet of it, before the men came. The last journal was different from the others. It was shorter, less systematic. The handwriting was the same, but the way it moved across the page was different, tighter, more careful, as though each sentence was being watched for what it might reveal. The entries were brief and dated several months apart and contained mostly practical information. And then in the final pages, something else. Ruth had written a poem. It was not very good poetry, technically speaking. It did not rhyme particularly well, and the meter was inconsistent. But when I read it for the first time sitting on the floor of the back room with the last of the afternoon light through the small window, I felt my breath change. Because the poem was not written for beauty. It was written for accuracy. It was a map. She had encoded the angle of entry and the depth of approach, and the landmarks visible from the hollow entrance, in language that looked like verse and functioned like directions. Every metaphor was a measurement. Every image was a compass bearing. The woman who could not write down the map directly because the map had been taken from her had written it in the one form they had left her with language, in the one form that might survive without looking like what it was. I read it 8 times that evening. By the end, I had it memorized. By the time I fell asleep that night, pressed under my blankets against the desert cold, I understood what my grandmother had hidden, and why, and for whom. She had hidden it for me. Not for me specifically. She had died before I was born, had no way of knowing that her daughter would have a daughter who would find the box behind the adobe wall on a September afternoon in 1884. But she had hidden it for whoever came. For whoever was next in the line of Vance women who understood what the mesa held. For whoever would be young enough and stubborn enough and hungry enough to finish what she had started. I read the journals again and again. Over the 3 years that followed my parents' deaths, I read them until I knew them nearly as well as I knew my own memories, which perhaps isn't saying very much given how unreliable memories are, but it says something about the intimacy. Ruth became familiar to me in the way that the dead sometimes become familiar when you have spent enough time with the traces they left. I knew her handwriting the way I knew my own. I knew the particular way she formed her sevens and the way she occasionally broke into a more rapid, looser script when she was excited about something and then corrected back to her usual careful hand. I knew when she was tired from the slight irregularity in the spacing. I knew when she was satisfied from the way the periods landed at the end of sentences. She had been, from what I could reconstruct, a woman of extraordinary patience and extraordinary precision. The kind of woman who does not arrive at conclusions quickly, but who, once she has arrived at them, does not leave them. The kind of woman who does not require other people's validation, but who understands clearly and without resentment that other people's validation is often what determines whether things get done. She had never gotten the validation. The Holcroft family had seen to that. And now, 3 years after my parents' deaths, with the valley entering its second year of the worst drought anyone living could remember, with Adelaide Holcroft's water prices rising every month as the wells shrank and the competition for what remained intensified, I was 18 years old and I had decided what I was going to do. What I had not anticipated was the lawyer. He arrived on a Wednesday in late August of 1887. A man in his 50s, sunburned and uncomfortable in a suit that had been made for a cooler climate, riding up to the adobe on a dun horse and climbing off with the deliberate care of a man whose back has made its opinions about horseback riding quite clear. He introduced himself as Emmett Farrow, representing the interests of Mrs. Adelaide Holcroft in various matters, and he said some documents he needed to discuss with me. I made him coffee. He sat at the kitchen table with his hat on the chair beside him and his briefcase open between us, and he extracted a sheaf of papers with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this many times before. The core of it was this: in October of 1855, my grandfather, Elias Vance, had signed a contract with Corbin Crane. The contract granted Crane and his successors exclusive water rights to any water discovered or extracted from the Vance property in perpetuity in exchange for the cancellation of an outstanding debt of $400 that Elias had owed to Crane for feed and livestock. The contract was legal. Farrow showed me the signatures, the notary stamped the county registration. It had been filed and recorded, and it was entirely valid. I looked at the date on the document. October 1855. Ruth had been forced to stop digging in October 1855. I looked at the document for a long time without speaking. Farrow was watching me with the expression of a man who does this for a living and has learned that silence is not necessarily the sign of shock that it looks like, that sometimes silence is the sign of a person thinking very carefully, and those are the ones you watch. What exactly does this mean for my current situation, I asked. Farrow explained. It meant that if I were to discover or extract any water from beneath my property, the rights to that water would belong to Adelaide Holcroft and her heirs. The water could be on my land, extracted by my labor, and it would belong to someone else. The contract contained no provision for compensation to the landowner. It was, as these things were written in 1855, entirely one-sided. It also meant, Farrow continued carefully, not looking directly at me, that there was a standing offer from Mrs. Holcroft regarding the debt remaining from my parents' final years, the accumulation of water payments and feed purchases, and various other obligations that came to approximately $640, and that was currently secured against the property. Mrs. Holcroft was prepared to forgive this debt entirely in exchange for a confirmation signature from me as current heir acknowledging the ongoing validity of the 1855 water rights agreement. All I had to do was sign. I set the papers down on the table. I'll need time to think about it, I said. Farrow nodded. He had expected this. Mrs. Holcroft appreciates the need for deliberation, he said. She's prepared to extend a 60-day window for your decision. After that, the debt situation becomes more complicated. He finished his coffee, packed his briefcase, thanked me for my hospitality, and rode away. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after he left, looking at the space where the papers had been. My grandfather had signed away the water rights in 1855. The same month Ruth was stopped. The same month the journal went silent. Corbin Crane had not merely stopped Ruth from digging. He had extracted a legal instrument from her husband that would ensure that even if she or anyone who came after her ever did find the water, it would belong to the Crane family. He had sealed the theft with a contract. He had used Elias's debt as the lever and the resulting document as the lock. Adelaide had not mentioned this contract when she was growing up sitting on her father's porch, but she had known about it. Of course she had known about it. It was registered with the county. Her lawyer had it in his briefcase. She had known all this time what the contract meant and what it had been created to accomplish, and she had done nothing about it. I went to the shelf. I took down my grandmother's Bible. I opened it to the back pages where Ruth had pressed to the poem, the one that looked like verse and functioned like a map. The paper was soft with age, the pencil lines faint but legible. I read it once more. I already knew it by heart, but I read it again anyway because reading something you know by heart is a different act from reciting it in your head. Your eyes slow you down. Your eyes make you look at each word individually instead of as part of the whole. And when I looked at the poem that way, word by word in the failing light of a late August afternoon, with the desert cooling outside and 60 days counting down in my head, I saw something I had not noticed before. The poem had been written in 2 stages. The main text was Ruth's steady, careful hand, but in the margins added later, written smaller, more compressed in ink that was slightly darker, as if from a different pen, were additional notations. Numbers, angles, a depth estimate written in feet, and a single line at the bottom of the final page written sideways in the margin barely legible that said, I found it. I could not reach it, but I found it. She had gone back. After 1855, after the contract and the men, and the taking of the map, she had gone back to the hollow. Not with a shovel that would have been too dangerous, but she had gone back and she had measured, and she had calculated, and she had arrived at a conclusion. She had found the water. She knew exactly where it was. She had written it into the margins of a poem that she then pressed inside a Bible and hid in a wall. And then she had died, and my mother had died, and my father had died, and here I was. I closed the Bible. I put it back on the shelf. I went outside into the evening air, and I stood at the edge of the property and looked east at the mesa. The last light was on the high rock, turning it the color of old copper, and the hollow at the base was already in shadow. The air coming out of it cool and steady, in the way Ruth had described, and that I had felt myself every time I had walked past it in the past 3 years. 55 degrees, even in August. Even now, 60 days. The next morning I went into Bright Creek, which was the nearest thing to a town in the valley, a main street of 8 buildings, and a population that fluctuated with the seasons and the water situation currently on the lower end of both. I went to the general store, which was run by a man named Abbott Haynes, who knew everything about everyone and was neither very discreet nor particularly malicious about it. I bought rope, a good pickaxe, 3 lanterns, lamp oil, and a quantity of timber supports that I had calculated I would need for the first section of the tunnel. I paid for them with money I had been saving for a year, which left me with considerably less than I was comfortable with, but considerably more than I was afraid of. While Haynes was writing up the purchase, the door opened and Adelaide Holcroft came in. She was not a physically imposing woman, medium height, well-dressed in the manner of someone who understood that in a small community appearance is a kind of statement. Her hair was iron gray, her face lined in the way of someone who had spent a great deal of time in Arizona's sun, and her eyes were a pale, clear blue that I had always associated with the color of sky reflected in still water, which is to say a color that looks like clarity, but is actually just an absence of depth. She looked at my purchases on the counter. She looked at me. "Miss Vance," she said, "Mrs. Holcroft." She did not ask me what the rope and the pickaxe and the timber were for. She was not a woman who asked questions whose answers she could already see. She looked at me for a moment with the particular stillness of someone who has made a calculation and arrived at a conclusion they find satisfying. "My lawyer tells me you have asked for time to consider the document." "That's right. 60 days is generous," she said. "I hope you'll use the time wisely." She bought what she had come for and left without saying anything more. Haynes watched her go and then looked at me with the expression of a man who is choosing for once to keep his observations to himself. I loaded my purchases into the wagon and drove back to the property. The following day, I went out to the hollow at the base of the East Mesa in the early morning, before the heat had come up and while the air from the rock was still distinctly cool against my face. I spent 2 hours examining the site with the attention that Ruth's journal had taught me to bring to it, the angles the fissures in the rock faced, the way the temperature distributed across the floor of the hollow, and how that distribution corresponded to the underground geometry Ruth had mapped. I found the place where the temperature was coldest. Not dramatically colder, a difference of perhaps 2 degrees from the surrounding ground, enough to notice if you were paying attention, invisible if you weren't. It was at the back of the hollow where the rock face was deepest, where the formation made a slight inward curve that was more protected from the sun than the rest of the hollow, and where the fissure pattern in the rock suggested an underlying channel running back and slightly downward into the mesa. I placed my hand flat against the rock there in the way Ruth had described, not pressing, just resting, letting the temperature move from the stone into my palm. 55 degrees, the same in August as it was in January. The same as it had been when Ruth stood here in 1853 and understood what it meant and started writing it down. The earth breathing, the earth saying here. Here is what you were looking for. Here is what has been waiting. I stood up. I looked at the hollow around me, at the sky above the mesa, at the flat, sun-hammered valley spread out to the west, where the people of Drywash were waking up to another day of a drought that had taken most of what they had left to take. I thought about my grandmother in this same hollow, standing in this same air, pressing her hand to this same rock. I thought about 60 days and $640 and a contract that had been written in 1855 to make sure that what I was about to do would not benefit me or my family, regardless of how it turned out. I thought about a line written sideways in a margin in pencil. I found it. I could not reach it, but I found it. I picked up the pickaxe. I struck the first blow. The sound of iron against stone rang off the hollow walls and came back at me from every direction, sharp and immediate, the sound of something beginning. The chips of rock fell at my feet in the gray morning dust. The cool air moved against my face the way it always moved, steady and indifferent, knowing what was behind the stone and not caring whether I found it or not, content to wait for as long as it took. I swung again. There are things I want to tell you about those first days because they matter, and because the version of this story that gets told often skips over them in favor of the parts that are more dramatic. The tunnel did not announce itself as the right direction immediately. The rock did not cooperate. I made mistakes that I didn't know were mistakes until they cost me time and effort and occasionally blood. I cut my hands in the first week in 3 separate places on edges I hadn't anticipated, and I wrapped them in strips of cloth and kept working because the alternative was not working, and not working was not something I was able to consider. What I had from Ruth's journals and from the poem was a starting angle and a general direction. What I didn't have was the refinement, the precise degree of descent, the exact bearing, relative to the hollow entrance, the specific location of the fissure that would eventually become the channel I was following. Those things I learned by doing, by putting iron against stone and listening to what the stone said back, by paying attention to the way the air moved in the tunnel as I went deeper, and the way the temperature behaved, and what those things were telling me about the geometry below. I was not a trained miner. I want to be clear about that. Everything I did in those first weeks I was doing for the first time, and the margin for error was considerable and frequently exceeded. But I had Ruth's notes, and I had 3 years of reading those notes until they were more familiar than my own memories. And I had the thing that Ruth herself had identified as the fundamental requirement: not skill, not strength, not tools, but patience. The willingness to go back the next morning regardless of how the previous morning had gone. The capacity to fail at something and not conclude from the failure that the thing was impossible. In the evenings after the light was too far gone to work safely in the tunnel, I would come out and sit at the entrance to the hollow and watch the valley darken and think about what the next day would require. I ate simply, I slept adequately. I kept the goats and the mules attended to. I did not go into Bright Creek more than once a week for supplies and to check the post. The first time I went into town, after I had started digging, I became aware of what people were saying. Haynes had apparently been unable to resist sharing the news of my purchases, or perhaps Adelaide had mentioned something, or perhaps in a valley this small, the information had simply moved through the air, the way information does in small communities, by a kind of community osmosis that doesn't require any single point of origin. They called it Nora's Folly. I heard it said in several ways, ranging from the genuinely sympathetic to the openly contemptuous. And I want to be honest, it landed. Not in the way things land when they change what you're doing, but in the way things land when they remind you that what you're doing is harder than it already is. That the people who don't believe you are not simply neutral, they are actively, collectively, daily not believing you. And the weight of that aggregate disbelief has a texture and a pressure that you feel even when you are alone in the dark 30 feet underground. Adelaide was the one who said it most directly. She came to the hollow one afternoon toward the end of September, a month after I had started digging, bringing with her 2 ranch hands and what I can only describe as the particular composure of someone who had already decided how this was going to end and was taking a relaxed professional interest in the interim. She stood at the entrance to the hollow, looking at the opening I had cut in the rock face, at the pile of chips and debris outside it, at the rope tied to a stake that I used to guide myself in the darkness. Her expression was the expression of someone who has looked at a thing and found it exactly as they expected. She said, "Your grandmother tried this." "I know," I said. "She failed." "She was stopped," I said. The distinction felt important. Adelaide looked at me for a moment with the pale blue eyes that gave nothing away. "I've heard the proposition before," she said, "that there's water in that formation. Every surveyor who's looked at this land has said otherwise. Every geologist who's passed through this territory has said otherwise." She paused. "Your grandmother was a stubborn woman." "Yes," I said. "She was." "So is stubbornness hereditary, or is it a choice?" "I'm still deciding," I said. She looked at me for another moment. There was something in that look that I did not have the experience yet to read, something that went slightly deeper than the professional assessment I would have expected. A slight adjustment in the stillness of her face, as though something had moved behind it and been corrected. Then it was gone, and she was looking at me with the calm, unreadable certainty of a woman who has already won and is simply waiting for the timeline to catch up. "Dig until your hands bleed," she said. "See if I care." She turned and walked away, her ranch hands a step behind her, their boots on the hollow floor, and then the gravel outside, and then the distance eating the sound of them. I looked at my hands. They were already bleeding from the morning's work. Wrapped in cloth, the cloth stained through in two places where the cuts were still not entirely closed. I looked at the opening in the rock. I picked up the pickaxe and went back inside. I did not know on that September afternoon about Amos Crowfoot. I did not know that there was a man 93 years old living in the hills above the valley who had been at this hollow 40 years before I was born. I did not know that the temperature I was following, the 55 degrees that Ruth had described and that I had found, and that was now 30 feet into the mesa, as constant and reliable as it had been at the surface. I did not know that this same temperature had been known and understood and followed by people whose knowledge of this land went back not 40 years but 10 generations. I did not know any of that yet. I was alone in a tunnel of my own making, learning by doing, making progress in making mistakes, paying attention to what the rock was telling me, and doing my best to understand a language I was teaching myself in real time. What I had was Ruth's poem memorized, running through my head in the darkness as I worked. What I had was the feel of the stone under my hands and the temperature of the air on my face, and the way the sound of the pickaxe changed when the rock ahead had something different on the other side of it. What I had was the 55 degrees that never changed, the constant that Ruth had identified, and that now deep in the mesa came not just from below, but from the walls on either side, as though the water I was moving toward was already beginning to make itself known. It was enough. It had to be enough. Outside, the valley continued to die, by degrees quiet and patient and thorough, the way things die, when there is no dramatic moment and no rescue on the horizon, and the drought just keeps being the drought, and the wells just keep getting lower, and the families just keep making the calculations that families make when the answer comes out wrong. Inside the tunnel, 30 feet in and getting deeper, I kept swinging. The sound of iron against stone rang off the walls and came back at me, the only sound in the world for as long as I was in there, which by October was most of the day. No one came to help. No one in those first weeks came at all, except once in the second week of October, when I came out of the tunnel at the end of the afternoon and found a cloth bundle sitting at the entrance to the hollow. Inside it were a corn cake and a jar of water and a piece of folded paper. On the paper, in an unpracticed hand from Drummond, East Property. I don't think you're wrong. I ate the corn cake. I drank the water. I put the paper in my coat pocket. I went back inside. The tunnel collapsed on a Thursday in March of 1888. I know it was Thursday because I had been keeping a journal of my own by then, not as careful or as systematic as Ruth's, but a record of progress in problems, distances, in angles, in the things the rock was showing me each day. The last entry before the collapse was dated Thursday, March 8th, and consisted of the following 72 feet. Air is moving, temperature holding. Something is different today in the quality of the silence. I don't know what I meant by that last line. I wrote it because I felt it, and I have learned to write down the things I feel in the tunnel, even when I cannot yet explain them, because often enough the explanation comes later, and the feeling turns out to have been right. But I didn't have time to investigate it before the ceiling came down. It was not a catastrophic collapse. I want to be precise about this because the word collapse suggests something total, a sudden and complete obliteration, and what happened was not that. It was a section of the ceiling in the middle portion of the tunnel, perhaps 10 feet of it, that had been quietly undermining itself, for reasons I had failed to identify, the structural integrity of the rock above, it compromised by a vertical fissure I had misread as stable, and which had been stable until the temperature of the early spring days reached a threshold that caused the rock to shift in a way that found the weakest joint. The sound was enormous in the enclosed space, an instant of absolute compression of sound, before the dust and the smaller fragments came down on top of me, and I was on my hands and knees trying to move toward the entrance before the larger pieces finished settling. The larger pieces finished settling before I reached the entrance. I was in the dark with a collapsed section of tunnel between me and the outside air, and I was intact, bruised, abraded, dusty, in every possible sense, but intact, and I had perhaps half a candle remaining in the lantern that had somehow survived the collapse without going out, and I had a pickaxe and I had about a pint of water in the flask I carried, and I had what I estimated was perhaps 6 hours of breathable air before the carbon dioxide in my portion of the tunnel built to a level that would be a problem. I did not panic. I want to be honest about this because I think it is important, and because I think the version of courage that gets discussed in these circumstances is usually the dramatic kind, the kind that involves a person overcoming their terror through some act of will. What I actually felt in the first minutes after the collapse was something more like clarity, a narrowing of the world to its essential elements: the candle, the air, the wall of debris between me and the outside, the distance and the pickaxe and the calculation of whether one person starting from the inside could clear enough of that debris in 6 hours to make a passage, and whether doing so would cause the compromised ceiling above the collapsed section to come down again. The calculation did not come out favorably, so I did not try to dig out. Instead, I sat down with my back against the tunnel wall in the farthest portion of the tunnel, the deepest part, the section closest to where I was working, and I rationed the candle and I breathed as slowly and evenly as I could manage. And I thought about what I knew about enclosed spaces and air quality and what the markers were and how much time I actually had. What I knew was that the temperature had not changed. The 55 degrees that held in the deepest part of the tunnel was still present, which meant that whatever ventilation was occurring between the tunnel and the water source below was still occurring. The air I was breathing was not entirely my own recycled air. It was coming from somewhere. This was what kept me alive in the direct physical sense. In the other sense, the sense that is harder to describe, the sense that has to do with the will to remain alive, which is a thing you don't know about yourself until it is tested. What kept me was something different. I thought about Ruth. I thought about her standing in the same tunnel in 1855, not knowing that it was 1855, not knowing that she had 2 years left before the men came working in the dark, with the particular focus of someone who has decided what matters and is doing it. I thought about the line in the margin. I found it. I could not reach it, but I found it. She had been stopped from outside. I was stopped from inside. There was a difference. I sat in the dark with my back against the wall of my grandmother's tunnel, and I waited for someone to notice I was gone. On the second day, I ate half of what was in my pockets, a piece of dried beef and a few crackers. Things I had started carrying out of habit. The habit of a woman who had been living alone and had learned that you keep something to eat on you because you never know when the day is going to go longer than planned. On the third day, the candle ran out. The darkness of a tunnel with no light source is a different thing from the darkness of a room at night or a cellar without a lamp or any of the ordinary darknesses that people experience and adjust to by waiting for their eyes to accommodate. There is nothing to accommodate to. There is simply no light. Your eyes open as wide as they can go and find nothing to work with. The darkness has weight and texture, and it presses against your eyeballs in a way that is entirely unlike anything else. After a while, you stop trying to see and start attending to the other senses, and what you find is that the other senses become larger, more detailed, more specific in the absence of vision. I could hear my own breathing with a precision that was almost clinical. I could feel the temperature of the air with a sensitivity I had never had above ground. I could detect on the third day a very faint movement in the air near the floor of the tunnel, almost nothing, barely more than the suggestion of movement that was coming from below from the direction I had been digging. The tunnel was breathing, and somewhere above the tunnel on the surface, the airflow that was ventilating my small portion of the earth was escaping through the fissures in the rock. Not much. A whisper of cold air seeping up through the hollow floor and dispersing into the Arizona afternoon. The kind of thing you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. The kind of thing you wouldn't know to look for unless you already understood what the temperature of 55 degrees meant and where it came from. On the morning of the fourth day, I heard something. Not above me to the side through the debris wall, a tapping, irregular at first, then more systematic, the percussion of someone working methodically through a problem and adjusting their approach as new information presented itself. The tapping of a person who was looking for something and knew how to listen for what the material was telling them. I moved toward the debris wall in the darkness, and I put my hand against the largest fragment I could find, and I felt the vibration of each tap coming through the stone. Someone was out there. Someone was on the other side. I tapped back. 3 times evenly spaced, the most basic possible communication. I am here. I am alive. The tapping on the other side stopped. Then after a moment, a single tap. Received. It took the better part of a day to make the passage. I could hear the work continuing steadily on the other side, not the panicked labor of someone trying to save a person they feared was already dead, but the methodical, unhurried work of someone who understood the problem and was solving it correctly. Each piece of debris moved with attention to what was above it, no piece dislodged carelessly. Nothing that would compromise the remaining ceiling before the passage was clear. When the light came through the first opening, a hole perhaps 8 inches across, I did not look at it directly. I had been in the dark for a day and a half, long enough that the light, even the dim light of late afternoon filtering through the hollow entrance and down the tunnel, was something my eyes needed time with. I heard a voice, old, measured, coming from behind the light. "Can you move if I'm?" "Yes," I said. "Then wait, another hour." I waited another hour. The passage widened until I could get through it on my hands and knees, and I did, and I came out into the part of the tunnel that had not collapsed, and I crawled toward the light, and I emerged into the hollow with the last of the afternoon on the rock walls and the cool air moving against my face and a man sitting on a flat stone near the entrance, watching me come out with the particular patience of someone who has been waiting for a specific event and is not surprised that it has occurred. He was old. Not old in the general sense, but old in the specific, unmistakable sense of someone who has accumulated a very long time and shows it in every line and angle, and the particular quality of stillness that very old people sometimes develop, a stillness that looks like repose, but is actually a kind of attentiveness, the practiced quiet of someone who has learned that listening is more useful than speaking and has been practicing for decades. He was Native American. I could not have told you his nation at the time. I knew very little about the peoples whose territory this had been before it was a territory at all, but I would learn over the months that followed that he was from a community whose presence in this desert reached back considerably further than any document the county registrar's office had ever seen. He looked at me coming out of the tunnel with the equanimity of someone who had been expecting me. Not me specifically, perhaps, but someone. Someone young with dirty hands and red hair turned gray with rock dust, climbing out of the East Mesa on a March afternoon and sitting down heavily on the hollow floor and breathing the outdoor air with the particular gratitude of someone who has recently understood the value of it. "You found the coal place," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," I said. "The hollow at the east face." He looked at the tunnel entrance. "The 55 degrees." I looked at him. "How do you know about that?" He was quiet for a moment, in the way that very old people are sometimes quiet, not because they are searching for an answer, but because they are deciding how much of the answer to give and in what order. "I knew a woman who showed it to me," he said, "a long time ago. He told me his name, Amos Crowfoot. He told me he lived in the hills above the valley in the northern section, on land that had belonged to his people since before the concept of belonging land had existed in this part of the continent. He told me he was 93 years old, which he said not with pride or complaint, but as a simple fact about his current situation, the way you might state any logistical reality about where you are and what you have. And then he told me about Ruth. He had met her in 1852, 1 year after she came to the valley, at a time when she was learning the land and asking questions of everyone who might know it, with the thorough and unself-conscious directness of someone who understood that knowledge has no origin requirement. Ruth had come to his community and sat down and asked about water, about where it was, how deep, what signs it left on the surface when it was moving below. They had developed over the following years a relationship that I would describe as a collaboration of observation. She brought her geological understanding, the Pennsylvania mining background, the formal knowledge of rock strata and underground water systems, and he brought what his people had accumulated over centuries of living in this desert, learning its language. The way you learn any language that is not your first, by immersion and necessity, and paying attention to what the land was saying. He had been with her at the hollow when she found the 55 degrees. He had confirmed what it meant. His people had a name for this phenomenon, a word that translated approximately as the Earth's breath, and they had been reading it for generations to locate reliable water in the desert. He had been with her the first day she brought a pick to the hollow and began to dig, and he had been there at a distance on the October day in 1855 when Corbin Crane's men came. He could not stop them. He had understood within and then the precise legal and physical realities of his position in the territory, And the realities were that a 93-year-old man, or rather the 58-year-old man he had been then watching from the hills above the hollow, had no standing and no recourse, and no means of intervention that would not have made things significantly worse for Ruth. So he had watched. He had memorized what he saw. He had kept the memory of everything Ruth had shown him about the hollow and the tunnel and the angle of approach and the calculations she had made about the depth and direction of the water below. He had kept it for 32 years. I thought someone would come, he said. The Vance women are not the kind of women who give up. I was sitting on the hollow floor with my back against the rock, still breathing the outside air with gratitude, looking at this man who had been waiting for me or someone like me for most of his adult life. The map, I said. Ruth's map. Her journals say they took the map. He nodded. They took the paper. Not what was in my head. He spent the next 2 hours giving me back what he had remembered. Angles, depths, the precise bearing of the water channel relative to the hollow entrance, as Ruth had calculated it, the refinements she had made in the final months before she was stopped. He had held this information for 32 years in the careful, organized way that people hold things when they understand that the holding is a responsibility. I had paper and a pencil in my coat pocket. I wrote everything down. When he was finished, he stood up slowly with the deliberate care of someone who has long since made peace with the physical requirements of rising from a seated position and looked at the tunnel entrance one more time. She said the water was there, he said. I believed her. So do I said. He looked at me with the specific quality of attention that I would come to understand as his version of approval. Not warm exactly in the way that warmth is usually performed, but genuine the way things are genuine when they have not been adjusted for an audience. Then you know what to do, he said. He walked out of the hollow and up the slope into the hills above, moving with the unhurried steadiness of someone who has somewhere specific to be and an entirely adequate amount of time to get there. I sat in the hollow for a while longer. Then I went into the tunnel and looked at the collapsed section and made my assessment. The next 3 days I spent clearing the debris and reinforcing the ceiling above it with the timber supports I had brought, learning as I went, the things that experienced miners know about how weight distributes in enclosed spaces and what the rock will and won't hold. I made new mistakes and corrected them. By the end of the 3 days, the passage was clear and reinforced, and I had a considerably more detailed understanding of the tunnel's structural vulnerabilities than I had possessed before the collapse. I also had Amos's map in my head and on my paper. And I had a direction that was slightly different from the one I had been following. Not dramatically different, a matter of a few degrees of bearing, but different in a way that Ruth had calculated in her final months, and that I had not known about until Amos gave it back to me. I went back to work. The second year was the year the valley began to fully understand what it was losing. It was 1889, and the drought had been running for 4 years, and the people who had stayed were the ones who either couldn't leave or had decided for reasons of history or stubbornness, or both, that they were going to outlast it. The Prescott family, who had been here since 1860, had reduced their herd to 12 animals and were farming a fraction of their original acreage. The Haynes family, who ran the general store, had taken in 2 of their adult children's families from neighboring properties that had failed. The Vickers, the Odoms, the Brewer family, all of them diminished versions of what they had been 3 years before, holding on with the particular bleak efficiency of people who have stripped everything down to what cannot be cut. And Adelaide Holcroft's water prices had gone up twice in 12 months. I was 200 feet into the mesa by then. 200 feet of tunnel carved out of solid Arizona rock over the better part of 2 years, reinforced with timber, where the ceiling required it ventilated by the natural airflow that Amos had confirmed was moving steadily from the water source below. The work had changed me in ways that were visible to anyone who looked. My hands were calloused to a thickness that I had never imagined hands could achieve. My shoulders had developed a breadth and definition that was entirely functional, the result of 2 years of swinging a pickaxe in an enclosed space where the only rest was the walk back out. I had learned to work in the dark, not in absolute darkness, but in the near dark of a lantern, nearly exhausted, where the information your hands gave you was more reliable than the information your eyes could provide. I had also learned by then to recognize the specific sounds the rock made before it did different things. The particular groan that meant stress but not imminent failure. The hollow sound that meant void ahead. The tight resistance sound that meant the formation ahead was denser than what I had been working through. These were the things that Amos had described Ruth learning and that he had tried to teach me in his periodic visits. He came perhaps once a month, sitting at the entrance to the hollow while I worked inside, available if I needed to consult him, not intruding when I didn't. The visits were not long. He did not waste words. He would ask how the work was going, and I would tell him, and he would either nod or ask a specific clarifying question, and I would answer it, and he would think about the answer and occasionally offer a piece of information that seemed minor, but usually turned out to be exactly the thing I needed 3 days later when the tunnel presented the specific problem his information addressed. He was the best kind of teacher, the kind who waits until you have the question before providing the answer so that when the answer arrives, it has somewhere to land. He never came inside the tunnel. This was a choice I understood instinctively and never asked about. The tunnel was mine and the work in it was mine, and his role was not to go inside but to be present at the threshold. Clem Drummond came more often. He lived on the east property about a quarter-mile from the hollow, a younger man, perhaps 22 or 23, who farmed the same kind of difficult, reluctant ground that my family had worked for 30 years. He had arrived in the valley with his uncle in 1885 and had stayed when the uncle moved on for reasons that he never fully explained and that I never fully pressed him on because they seemed to involve a kind of rootedness that I recognized and did not need to interrogate. He brought food. This was his primary contribution, and it was not a small one. The work in the tunnel was physically demanding enough that the calories I could produce from my 40 acres and the small income from occasional hired work were not quite sufficient. Clem seemed to understand this without my saying anything about it, and he arrived at the hollow perhaps twice a week with the surplus from his own modest production. Corn-dried beans, occasionally a piece of smoked meat left without ceremony at the entrance to the hollow, and taken without ceremony by me. He did not ask about the tunnel. He did not offer advice. He showed up, left what he had brought, and went back to his own work. The few times we talked, it was about practical matters, the state of the water supply, the condition of the road, the news from Bright Creek. He was not a man who filled silence with language, and I valued this in a way that was difficult to articulate, except to say that the silence felt like respect rather than indifference. On the 340th day of the second year, I know this because I was still keeping the journal, Adelaide Holcroft arrived at the hollow with Farrow the lawyer and a document that she wanted me to sign. The document was not the same document Farrow had presented in 1887. That original was still in his briefcase, still valid, still waiting for my signature. This was something else. In the 26 months since my parents' deaths, Adelaide had been conducting a quiet financial operation that I only understood fully when Farrow explained it to me. She had located every debt outstanding against the Vance property, the various water accounts, the feed debts, a small agricultural loan my father had taken out in 1882, and she had purchased them, bought them from their various creditors at a discount because debts against a property in the hands of an 18-year-old girl with no family looked to most creditors like debts that were unlikely to be fully recovered. The total consolidated under Adelaide's ownership was $640. She was prepared to forgive all of it, every dollar, in exchange for my confirmation signature on the 1855 Water Rights Agreement. The new document was a restatement of the original, legally tightened, with my signature making explicit what my grandfathers had only implied, that the Holcroft family's claim on any water discovered on Vance land extended in perpetuity and applied to me specifically as the current heir. She gave me 60 days. Adelaide herself said nothing while Farrow presented the terms. She stood at the entrance to the hollow in the good dress and looked past me at the tunnel opening with the expression she always wore when she was looking at things, the pale-eyed assessment that took in information without revealing what it thought about the information. Then she looked at me. "You've made progress," she said. "Some," I said. "2 years of progress." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. The sun was at a particular angle that put the hollow in shadow and the valley below in bright afternoon light, and from where I was standing I could see the full length of the valley floor, the dried wash, the scattered properties, the dust that rose from the road where no one was riding because there was nowhere worth going. "The valley is dying," she said, not as an observation, as a fact she had assessed and categorized and filed. "I know," I said. "My wells are at 60% of what they were 4 years ago." A pause. 40% of what they were 10 years ago. I looked at her. This was more than she had ever said to me about her business operations, and I did not entirely trust the offering, but I listened. I am telling you this not as a concession, she said, but as information. The situation in this valley is severe and it is going to become more severe. Whatever you believe about what is in that rock, a slight gesture toward the tunnel entrance. The practical reality is that there is currently no water. And the practical reality is that I have $640 of leverage over your land. I said, I have 60 days. She looked at me for a long moment. You do, she said. She walked away. Pharaoh followed. I watched them go until the distance absorbed them. Then I went back into the tunnel. The 60 days came and went without my signature. Pharaoh sent a letter. I sent back a letter that said I was still considering the matter and needed more time. This was a legal maneuver of the crudest possible kind, and both Adelaide and I knew it, but it functioned in the short term, the way crude maneuvers sometimes function, by buying time that could be used for something else. The something else was 210 feet of tunnel. By the time I had exhausted every reasonable delay, I was past the point where Adelaide's document mattered in the way she intended it to matter, because I could feel in the quality of the air and the specific temperature of the walls that I was getting close. Not today. Asusaming. Not next week. But the kind of close that you can feel in the rock before you can prove it by any other means, the way you can feel a change in weather before the clouds show up to confirm it. The valley continued to empty. Families who had held on through 2 years of the drought left in the third year, loading what they had into wagons and heading for Tucson or California or somewhere they had relatives who had room. The general store reduced its inventory. The school closed for a month when the teacher's family left and then reopened when a retired teacher from Prescott County agreed to come. Clem Drummond did not leave. He continued to bring food to the hollow twice a week, though his own situation was tightening in the way that everyone's situation in the valley was tightening. I did not ask him to stop, and he did not offer to stop, and so it continued the silent, regular presence of someone who had decided without announcement that this was a thing worth supporting. Amos came once a month and sat at the hollow entrance and asked how the work was going. And Adelaide sent 2 more letters through Pharaoh, each one noting that the matter of the outstanding debt remained unresolved and that the Holcroft family's patience, while genuine, was not unlimited. I filed both letters with the others. I went back to work. The third year was the year the tunnel became everything. By then I was no longer a girl who was digging a tunnel. I was a person whose entire existence had organized itself around a single sustained act of will, the way some lives organize themselves around a cause or a belief. The tunnel was not something I was doing. The tunnel was what I was. The 40 acres and the animals and the meals I ate and the sleep I slept were all in service of it, all the logistics of keeping a body functioning. That was the instrument of a larger purpose. 280 feet, 290, 300. The air in the tunnel had changed. Not dramatically, it was still cool, still moving in the faint way it had always moved, but the quality of it was different from the quality of the air at the surface in a way I could no longer attribute to mere depth. It was wetter in a way that was not moisture exactly, but a hint of it, the suggestion of water somewhere in the rock that was beginning to make itself known. The temperature on the walls had dropped half a degree, not measurable by any instrument I had, but perceptible to palms that had spent 3 years developing sensitivity to small variations in stone. I was close. I went into the tunnel every morning before it was fully light, and I came out when my lantern fuel required it, and some days I went back in with a fresh lantern and worked through to the middle of the afternoon. My hands were instruments now, not merely hands. They could read the rock the way I had once read Ruth's journals, not quickly, but with the accumulated understanding of someone who had been paying close attention to the same material for a very long time. On the evening of the 3rd day of February 1890, I ran out of lamp oil. I had miscalculated. I had brought what I calculated was sufficient for the day's work, plus a margin of safety, and the day's work had gone longer than I planned because I was making progress, and the specific kind of progress I was making, the rock was beginning to change character, becoming more fissured. The sound of the pickaxe different, in a way, I was trying to understand made it impossible to stop. I kept going past the point where I should have turned back, and then the lantern dimmed and flickered and went out. 310 feet from the entrance, I was in absolute darkness. I have described what absolute darkness in a tunnel is like, and I will not repeat it here except to say that it is different at 310 feet than it is at any depth I had previously experienced it. The world of sensory information available to you is the same, the touch, the temperature, the sound, but the sense that the darkness extends outward in all directions without limit is more complete at this depth, more thorough, more final. You understand in a way you do not understand at lesser depths that you are inside a mountain, that the mountain is very large and you are not. I sat down with my back against the right-hand wall as I had learned to do in the darkness, always the right-hand wall, never the left or the center, so that I always knew my orientation relative to the entrance. I was thinking about how long it would take me to walk out 310 feet in the dark when my left hand resting on the floor beside me felt something. Not rock, not the smooth, worn stone of the tunnel floor that I had been walking on for 3 years. Something with a different texture, a surface worked by tools rather than by water or geological pressure. The flat circular face of something cast rather than formed. I picked it up. It was iron. A disc of iron perhaps 8 inches across with a collar around the edge and a socket in the center where a wooden handle would have been fitted. The socket was empty. The wood had long since gone. But the iron itself was intact, heavy with the dense solidity of metal that has been properly made and had nothing to corrode it except time and the slight moisture of the deep tunnel air. It was a pickaxe head, BM, not a modern one. The style of it, the proportions, the way the collar had been formed, the specific weight distribution between the point end and the face, was the style of tools made in the first half of the century, the Pennsylvania mining style, the style that would have been familiar to a woman who had grown up near mines in the 1830s and 1840s and had learned what a good tool felt like before she came to Arizona and needed to make use of that knowledge. The style of tools that Ruth Vance would have brought with her to Dry Wash Valley in 1851. I sat in the absolute dark, 310 feet inside the mesa, with my grandmother's pickaxe head in my hands, and I understood what I was holding. She had been here. Not down the road, not in the adjacent county, not somewhere in the long history of the Vance family that I had reconstructed from journals and memory and the things Amos had told me. Here, in this specific tunnel at this specific depth, in the specific darkness that I was currently sitting in. She had swung this pickaxe at this rock in this exact location, and the head had come loose from the handle, which happened with old tools after enough impacts and had been left here when she was forced to stop. Forced out of the tunnel and out of the hollow and up to the surface and away from the East Mesa that she had spent 2 years reading and 2 years digging into. She had been stopped here. At this depth, at 310 feet, the water was not far beyond. She had known that. Amos had known that. The notes in the margin of the poem had said as much, though obliquely. She had been 30, perhaps 40 feet from the thing she had been looking for, and she had been stopped, and she had carried the memory of it for the rest of her life and passed it to her daughter, and her daughter had carried it to her death and given it to me. 3 years of my life had brought me to the place where the person before me had been stopped. I was 30 or 40 feet from the water, probably less. Possibly I would have reached it that afternoon if the lantern hadn't failed. I sat in the darkness, and I held the iron in my hands, and for the first time in the 3 years since I had buried my mother, I cried. Not from grief exactly, or not only from grief, from something that is adjacent to grief and is sometimes confused with it, but is different the recognition of what a thing has cost and who has paid it and in what currency. Ruth had paid years in work in the particular cost of being a woman who was right about something important in a world that would not let her be right. My mother had paid the daily maintenance of a hope she had inherited and could not prove and could not let go of. My father had worked the 40 acres and paid the water bills and accepted the terms imposed on him by a situation he had not created and could not change. I sat in the dark and I held my grandmother's pickaxe and I told her what I had found and where I was and how close we were. I don't know if she heard me. I don't know what I believe about what happens to people after they die, and I have never been very interested in the theology of it. But I know I said the words into the dark and with the iron in my hands, and the tunnel was very still and very cool, and the air was moving faintly against my face with the steady exhalation of the water that was somewhere below. I said, I'm here. I found where you stopped. I'm gonna finish it. Then I got up because there was nothing to be gained by staying in the dark, and I put the pickaxe head in the pocket of my coat, and I walked the 310 feet back to the entrance with my hand on the right-hand wall. I came out into the night, which was cold and full of stars, in the way that Arizona nights are full of stars, extravagantly and differently, as though the sky had no interest in the scale of human difficulty and was simply doing what it had always done. I sat at the entrance to the hollow for a long time. In the morning, I went into Bright Creek and bought lamp oil and 3 additional wicks and came back and filled the lantern and went back into the tunnel. I did not mention what I had found to anyone. I put the pickaxe head on the shelf where I kept the journals beside the Bible with Ruth's poem inside it, and I went back to work. At 315 feet, the character of the rock changed. At 318 feet, I could hear something. Not the mechanical sounds of the tunnel, not my own breathing, or the sound of the pickaxe, or the distant shift of settling rock above me. Something else. Something that was not a sound I had made, and not a sound the tunnel was making on its own. A sound that the rock was carrying. Low, almost below, hearing a vibration more than a sound. The resonance of moving water somewhere below, transmitted through solid stone, the way sound travels through stone, which is faster and farther than through air. I put my ear against the wall. I closed my eyes, though the darkness made the closing of them meaningless. I listened. Water, running somewhere below me, cold and constant, and completely indifferent to the 3 years I had spent getting here. Not knowing or caring that a woman had found it from above in 1853 and been stopped and passed the knowledge forward, and a girl had spent 3 years following the knowledge down. Just running the way water has always run through stone since before there were people to hear it. I took the pickaxe off my shoulder. I was not going to reach it today. I understood this. The rock above the channel was still substantial, and I was tired, and the lamp was 3/4 used. Today was not the day, but today was the day I knew for certain that Ruth had been right, that the 55 degrees was what she said it was, that the tunnel was going the right direction and had been going the right direction with the corrections Amos had provided for 3 years, that the water was there, and I was going to reach it. I put my hand against the wall. 55 degrees, constant. Unchanged since the first morning I had stood in the hollow and felt the air on my face and understood what I was standing over. I took one breath of that air, the deep mineral, slightly damp air of rock that has water running through it somewhere below. Then I went back out. Amos was sitting at the entrance to the hollow as he sometimes was when he came. He was looking out at the valley, which was still in the grip of the drought, the wash bone dry and white, the properties along its edge reduced and diminished and holding on. He heard me come out and turned to look at me. He read my face the way he read everything, carefully without hurry. "You heard it," he said. "Yes," I said. He looked back at the valley. "Ruth heard it too," he said, "in 1855 before they came. She told me. She said it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard." He was quiet for a moment. She was right. I sat down beside him. The afternoon was long and the shadows were getting longer, and the valley below us was quiet in the particular way of a place that is waiting for something that is coming, whether it knows it or not. "How much farther?" I asked. Amos thought about it. "Not far," he said. "She was very close." "You are very close." A pause. "Days, maybe. Not months." I looked at the hollow entrance, and the cool air was moving out of it with the same steady pulse it had always had. "Days, maybe." I thought about Ruth sitting somewhere not very far from where I was sitting now, after a day in the tunnel, but having heard what I had just heard, knowing what she knew, and then going back the next day and the next until the day she couldn't. I was not going to have that day. I stood up. "Tomorrow," I said. Amos nodded. I went inside to prepare the lantern for the morning. The morning I broke through, I almost died. I want to tell you this plainly without the kind of reshaping that stories sometimes do to their most important moments. The tidying up of chaos into narrative shape the removal of the parts that are not heroic or instructive or in keeping with the theme. What happened when I finally reached the water was not triumphant. It was terrifying. And the terror was the specific, particular terror of irony, nearly 3.5 years of work, nearly 1,000 mornings of going into the dark and swinging iron against stone. And what nearly killed me was the thing I had been trying to find. It was April, the spring of 1890, 3 years and 2 months since I had struck the first blow, and I was at 318 feet working the face of the rock that separated me from the sound I had been hearing for 2 weeks. The low, vibrating resonance of water moving through stone transmitted up through the formation to where I pressed my ear against the wall and listened to it every morning before I began. The rock had changed. It was different here from what it had been through most of the tunnel. Less dense, more fissured, the kind of formation that geologists would describe as having been subjected to the pressure of long contact with water, the stone slowly modified by what was moving past it in the dark. I understood this from Ruth's journals, from the descriptions she had made of what the rock would look like when I was getting close. Paler, more fractured, responding differently to the pickaxe, not with the solid resistance of deep granite, but with a more yielding quality, as though the stone understood that its time as a barrier was nearly up. I had been working that face for 5 days. Small progress each day. The rock required patience, required attention to the fissure lines, required the understanding that forcing the wrong section would bring the ceiling down rather than opening the passage. What I had developed over 3 years was the ability to read the face of the stone the way a carpenter reads the grain of wood, understanding that things have a natural direction and that the work goes better when you find that direction and follow it rather than imposing your own. On the morning of April 14th, I found a section of the face where the fissure pattern converged. 3 fault lines meeting at a point, the rock between them, under pressure from both sides like a door held shut by its own weight rather than by a lock. I spent the better part of the morning working around the edges of it, not striking the center, but reducing the support at the margins, and around midday, I felt the whole section shift, not fall, not yet, but acknowledge that it was ready to go. I stepped back. I had learned in 3 years of working in enclosed stone that stepping back is sometimes the most important movement you can make. I struck the center once, the section gave way. What came through the opening was not a trickle. It was not the cautious beginning of something that could be managed and directed. It was a column of water under pressure, cold, absolutely cold, the cold of something that had been contained a long time and was released all at once, and it hit me in the chest with a force that knocked me off my feet. I went down in water that was already 6 inches deep and rising faster than I could process it. The lantern hit the wall and went out. Absolute darkness, immediate and total, and water rising to my waist as I got to my feet. And the sound of it, the real sound of it, not the transmitted resonance through stone, but the sound of moving water in an enclosed space which is enormous and fills everything, hit me like the darkness had hit me completely and without mercy. I ran. 318 feet. I had walked that distance so many times that my body knew it without thinking, knew where the ceiling dropped slightly at 240 feet, knew the slight left-hand curve at 190, knew the section at 112 feet, where the old timber reinforcement from the first year had been replaced and the floor was slightly uneven. My body knew all of it, and I ran it in the dark with water at my thighs and then my waist and then my chest, not in a straight line, but close enough to straight my hand grazing the right-hand wall at intervals to confirm direction. The water behind me was faster than I was. I understood this the way you understand physical facts during the events that demonstrate them directly without mediation, the water cold against my back as I ran the cold of something that has been moving through stone at 55 degrees for longer than any human being has been alive, and now released into the space I was also occupying with the indifference of water for anything that is not water. At 150 feet, I fell. The uneven section. I had known it was there. My body knew it was there. But running in absolute darkness at a speed I had no reason to be running in this tunnel changes the relationship between knowing and responding, and I went down hard face first into water that was now chest deep, even lying flat on the floor, and I swallowed some of it, and I got up again in the dark with water in my lungs and kept running because stopping was not a viable option, and the entrance was still 70 feet ahead. At 60 feet, I could see a difference in the darkness. Not light exactly, nothing as legible as light, but a reduction of the total dark, a gradient, the pale gray suggestion of the direction where outside was. I ran toward it. I came out of the tunnel on my hands and knees, gasping into April's sunlight that hit me with the same completeness as the darkness had, immediate total requiring adjustment. I fell sideways onto the floor of the hollow, and lay there breathing face against the stone water pouring out of the tunnel entrance behind me and spreading across the hollow floor and beginning in the way that water finds its level to run down the slope toward the valley below. I lay there for what was probably not very long, but felt from the inside like a substantial portion of my life. Then I heard a voice. It was not a voice I had been expecting. It was male, professionally modulated, and it belonged to a man who had not anticipated finding a woman in his immediate vicinity, covered in water and rock dust, and gasping like a landed fish. Emmett Farrow was standing at the entrance to the hollow with a document in his hand. Behind him, two ranch hands on horses. And behind them, at the edge of the hollow, Adelaide Holcroft on a gray mare watching. Farrow had come with the final notice. The 60 days had been extended and re-extended through a series of legal delays that had run their course, and the Holcroft claim on the Vance property debt was now at the point where action was required, and the document in his hand was the first step in that action. He was looking at the water. The water was coming out of the tunnel at a rate that was already in the 30 seconds I had been lying on the hollow floor. Considerable, not the dramatic volume of the initial pressure release, but a steady, serious, cold, clear flow that had found the channel of the hollow floor and was running down the slope with the easy confidence of something that has been waiting to do exactly this for a very long time. It was 6 inches wide at the tunnel entrance and spreading. It was cold. I could see the faint temperature differential in the air above it, the slight shimmer of cold meeting warm spring air. It was clean. It had that particular clarity, that deep water has the clarity of something that has been filtered through hundreds of feet of stone. Farrell looked at the water. He looked at his document. He looked at me. I got up from the hollow floor. I was soaking wet and probably not a particularly dignified sight, but I had been in the tunnel for 3.5 years, and I had stopped being concerned about dignity somewhere around the end of the first one. I looked at Adelaide. She was looking at the water. Her face was doing something that I had never seen it do in any of our previous encounters. Not the assessment, not the professional composure, not the pale-eyed certainty of someone who had already decided the outcome. Something was moving behind it, an expression I could not immediately identify because I had not seen it on her before. "Your document," I said to Farrow, "is for a debt secured against land that contains a water source. The water source is a natural feature. Natural water sources in Arizona territory under the Act of March 1889 are not subject to private ownership agreements of the type represented by the 1855 contract." Farrow was still looking at the water. I had spent a week the previous autumn in the Tucson County Records Office reading legislation. It was not the kind of week I would have chosen to spend if other options had been available, but other options had not been available, and what I found in the records was what I needed to find. Arizona had been pushing toward territorial water law for years, and the Act of March 1889 had formalized what had been building a legal framework that treated natural underground water sources differently from privately constructed wells, that recognized the prior claim of the land over any contractual arrangement that predated the Act, and that specifically invalidated agreements signed under conditions of economic duress. The 1855 contract had been signed under conditions of economic duress. Elias Vance had owed $400 to Corbin Crane. The contract had been the price of the debt's cancellation. There had been no independent legal counsel. There had been no negotiation. There had been, by the account in the later journals and by what Amos had witnessed, men with guns present when Ruth was stopped. The document in Farrow's hand was a piece of paper. The water running down the slope was a fact. Facts, in my experience, have a longer useful life than documents. Farrow looked at Adelaide. She was still watching the water. Whatever was moving behind her face had not resolved into anything legible. She looked at me once briefly with the pale blue eyes, and then she looked back at the water, and then she turned her horse and rode down the slope toward the valley. She did not say anything. Farrow put the document back in his briefcase. He left without ceremony, the ranch hands following the sound of the horses moving away down the slope, and then the gravel road, and then distance swallowing them. I stood alone in the hollow with the water running past my feet. I listened to it for a long time. I did not tell anyone for a week. This surprised people afterward when the story was told. They expected something immediate, a girl running into town with her hands still wet from the tunnel, the dramatic announcement, the vindication witnessed by the community that had laughed at her for 3 years. Stories about discoveries usually have that shape. The discovery, the revelation, the world transformed. What I did was watch. I had spent 3 years learning to pay attention to things before drawing conclusions, and the water was no different from anything else. I needed to know that it would hold. I needed to know that the flow was not a pressure release that would exhaust itself in hours or days, the emptying of a contained reservoir rather than the opening of a connected system. I had Ruth's calculations and Amos's knowledge and my own 3 years of following the temperature down through the rock, and everything pointed toward a connected system, a genuine underground river rather than a pocket of stored water. But pointing toward was not the same as confirming, and I had learned to wait for confirmation. I spent the week at the hollow watching the flow, measuring it as best I could with the tools I had, testing the temperature at different times of day. It held at 55 degrees, regardless of the hour, regardless of whether the sun was on the hollow or in shadow, regardless of the warm Arizona afternoons that made the surface of the valley floor reach 90 degrees and above. The water did not know about the surface temperatures. It was doing what it had always done at the depth it came from, and the surface had no claim on it. By the end of the week, the flow was consistent and, to my measurement, undiminishing. The channel I had excavated was carrying it cleanly. The basin I had begun to shape in the lower part of the hollow was filling and spilling down the natural drainage toward the valley. On the morning of the 8th day, I went back inside to look at the tunnel. The water was flowing through the gap I had opened in the rock face with a steady energy, not the initial flood of the pressure release, but the settled permanent flow of a connected system that had found its outlet. The floor of the tunnel was wet but passable. The water was cold and clear. I put my hand in the flow. 55 degrees, the same temperature it had been in the hollow since 1853. I stood there for a while with my hand in the water and thought about my grandmother in Pennsylvania as a girl, learning what deep stone feels like, learning that the earth keeps a temperature that the seasons cannot reach, that there is a depth at which everything stabilizes and holds. I thought about her bringing that knowledge across the country and recognizing it here in this hollow, in this particular quality of air. I thought about the 34 years between her recognition and her death, and the years my mother carried it, and the years I had spent with my hands in the rock. Then I went inside to get dressed properly. I walked into Bright Creek that morning with a bucket in each hand. 2 buckets filled at the hollow basin carried 3 miles on foot down the road into town. I had not announced my arrival. I had not told anyone I was coming. I did not hurry. I walked at the pace that 3 years in a tunnel had made my natural pace steady, attentive to the ground underfoot, not wasting energy on speed I did not need. The town was doing its morning business when I came in off the road. Haynes was sweeping the front of the general store. 2 women I knew from the outer properties were at the post office. A man whose name I never remembered was working on something at the far end of the street. I set the buckets down in the center of Main Street. I didn't say anything for a moment. I just set them down. 2 buckets sloshing slightly from the walk, cold enough that you could see the temperature differential in the warm morning air, absolutely clear in the way that deep water is clear. Haynes stopped sweeping. One of the women at the post office turned and looked. "Where did that come from?" Haynes said. He was looking at those buckets with the expression of a man who knows water in the desert and knows that this water is different from the water he has been seeing. "From my tunnel," I said, "the one everyone said led nowhere." He came closer. He looked into one of the buckets. He was quiet for a moment. "That's cold," he said. 55 degrees, I said. "Same in August as it is now." The women from the post office had come over. Other people were appearing in doorways, the way people appear in doorways when something is happening in the street that is not the usual business of the day. Someone dipped a cup. Someone drank. There was a silence after the drinking that was different from other silences, the silence of something being confirmed rather than something being processed. More people came. The news of the valley traveled fast in those years, the way news travels in communities that have been stripped down to the people who are still there, not many but dense, connected by the proximity of difficulty. By noon, there were perhaps 40 people at the buckets and at the hollow filling whatever they had that could hold water. And by evening, word had reached the properties on the outer ring of the valley, and people were beginning the drive in. I stood to the side of most of it. I had said what I had to say, which was almost nothing, and the water was saying the rest. That seemed correct. The water had waited a long time to speak for itself. Clem Drummond found me at the edge of the crowd in the late afternoon, standing near the entrance to the general store watching. "You actually did it," he said. "My grandmother did it," I said. "I finished it." He looked at me for a moment with the particular expression he had used for most of the time I had known him, attentive without being intrusive, present without requiring anything from the presence. "Is it going to hold?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He nodded. We stood there for a while watching people fill containers at the buckets, watching children who had grown up in the drought years run through the small overflow that was trickling down the street. Not entirely understanding what they were seeing, but responding to it, the way children respond to the release of tension in the adults around them, with a sudden, uncomplicated joy. He said, "I never thought you were wrong." "I know," I said. "Thank you for the food." He looked sideways at me. Something in his expression shifted into something that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "It was corn cake," he said. "It wasn't nothing." "It wasn't nothing," I agreed. Adelaide came 2 days later. Not to the hollow, which had by then become a destination, people from across the valley coming to fill containers, to see the water running out of the hillside, to stand in the cool air and put their hands in the flow and confirm with their own senses what they had been told. She came to my door, the adobe door on the 40 acres that her family had been trying to acquire through one mechanism or another for 35 years. She came alone. No lawyer, no ranch hands, no horses. She walked up the path from the road in the early morning, and I saw her coming through the window, and I opened the door before she knocked. She looked different from every other time I had seen her. Not smaller Adelaide Holcroft was not a woman who reduced easily, and the physical reality of her was the same as it had always been. But something in the set of her face was different. The assessment was still there, the pale eyes still reading the scene as she entered it. But the settled certainty was gone, or at least moved back from where it usually lived, which was at the front of her expression, visible to anyone looking. I made coffee. We sat at the table where Pharaoh had sat 3 years before with his briefcase open and his documents spread between us. It was a different table and a different morning, and I was a different person than I had been then, and Adelaide knew it, and I knew it, and neither of us pretended otherwise. She accepted the coffee. She held the cup and looked at it, and then looked at me. "My lawyer tells me the 1855 contract is unenforceable," she said. "Yes." "And the debt?" "The debt still exists," I said, "but it's not secured against anything that can be taken." She nodded. She had known this before she came. Pharaoh had told her. She had not come to discuss the legal situation. She had come for something else, and she was working her way toward it in the careful manner of someone who is not accustomed to approaching difficult conversations and is taking it slowly. I helped her. I went to the shelf. I took down the last of Ruth's journals, the short one, the careful one, the one with the entries that had been watched over as they were written. I opened it to the final page and I set it in front of Adelaide. She looked at it, at the handwriting which was Ruth's careful hand. The letters precisely formed, the lines kept straight. At the last entry, 6 words a period at the end, pressed down hard. "They came today and took the map. I will not write more." She read it for a long time. Then I took the other document from the shelf. Not a journal this time. A piece of paper, older, more official in its form, a county record, a copy I had obtained from the Tucson registrar's office during the week I had spent there reading legislation. It was a record of a complaint filed in 1855 by one Ruth Vance against one Corbin Crane, alleging trespass and destruction of property. The complaint had been dismissed. The dismissal notation in the county clerk's handwriting noted that the matter had been resolved between the parties. At the bottom of the document, in the section where official action had been authorized, was a signature. Not the county clerk's signature. A second signature, a personal authorization that had been affixed before the document was filed, indicating that the dismissal had been reviewed and approved at the level above the county clerk. The signature belonged to Corbin Crane. He had authorized the dismissal of his own victim's complaint, had sat in his position in the territorial administration, and put his name to the document that made Ruth's attempt at legal recourse disappear before it was ever heard. Adelaide looked at his signature for a very long time. The morning was moving around us. Outside the window, the light was doing what it does in Arizona in April, making the desert look like it could offer almost anything. the colors warm and the air still cool and everything appearing for a few hours each morning to be at the beginning of something rather than in the middle of something difficult. He told me about her, Adelaide said. Her voice was different from usual. Not softer exactly, more direct the way a voice gets when it has stopped performing a version of itself and is just saying the thing. When I was a girl, sitting on the porch of the ranch, he said there had been a woman named Vance who thought there was water in the East Mesa. He said she was stubborn and wrong-headed and that he had persuaded her to stop. A pause. He used the word persuaded. I know what he meant, I said. Yes. She was still looking at his signature. I knew what he meant too, even then. I was perhaps 11 years old, and I knew what the word meant when he said it because I knew my father. She set the document down. I never asked him about it again. I never asked him about any of it. The water writes the contract, what actually happened at the hollow that day. She looked at her coffee cup. I chose not to know the details. But you knew the outline. I knew the outline, she said it flatly. Not as a confession exactly, as an acknowledgement. The difference between a confession and an acknowledgement is that a confession seeks something in return, absolution understanding the reduction of guilt. An acknowledgement doesn't seek anything, it just states what is true. She had known, not in the detailed documented sense that I had come to know it over 3 years of reading and research, but in the way that children of powerful men know the foundations of the power, not the mechanics, not the specific actions, but the general shape of what was done and what it cost other people. Adelaide Holcroft had grown up knowing that her family's monopoly on the valley's water rested on something that had been taken. She had organized her entire adult life around maintaining an arrangement that she understood at some level she had never examined closely was built on her father's violence. She had run the water operation with efficiency and without apparent cruelty, and she had chosen every single day not to look at what was underneath it. I did not tell her I understood. I did not offer her the comfort of understanding, because understanding was not what this required. What it required was for her to sit at my table in the house on the land her family had been trying to take for 35 years and look at her father's signature at the bottom of a document that had erased Ruth Vance's attempt at justice and hold the full weight of what she knew. She held it. After a long time, she said, "Your grandmother was right about the water." "Yes," I said. "She was right all along." "All along," I said. Adelaide set the document down. She finished her coffee. She stood up and put the cup in the proper place and straightened her jacket with the automatic precision of a woman who has spent 55 years managing her own presentation. At the door, she stopped. She did not turn around. She spoke to the door. "Your grandmother deserved better than what my family gave her." It was not an apology. It was a statement of fact. She was not asking me to do anything with it or say anything in response. She was simply stating something true that she had known for a very long time and had not previously said aloud. She walked out. I watched her go down the path to the road and turn toward the valley without looking back. The following week, Adelaide Holcroft's primary well, the deepest and most reliable of the 4 wells on the Holcroft Ranch, the one that had produced steadily through 4 years of drought, went dry. I did not know this immediately. Clem told me. He had heard it from Haynes, who had heard it from someone who had been to the ranch on an unrelated errand. The well had not gradually diminished the way wells diminish during drought. It had produced normally on Monday and been dry on Wednesday. The other wells on the property showed the same sudden absence 2 days later. I thought about Ruth's calculations, about Amos's knowledge of the underground geography, about the way the underground river had moved through the mesa to the east and connected at depth to the formation below the valley floor. The Holcroft wells had always drawn from the same source as the water that ran through the mesa, not directly connected, not the same water, but hydraulically linked, drawing from the same deep system. When I opened the tunnel and the water found the path, it had been looking for the path through the mesa and out the hillside. The underground system had reorganized itself around the new outlet. It had done what water does when you give it an easier path. It had taken the easier path. The Holcroft wells had been downstream of the new outlet. The water that had fed them was now feeding something else. I did not feel triumph about this. I want to be precise about that because I think the emotion that people expect in this kind of story is triumph, the villain's instrument of oppression, undone by the same forces that the villain had tried to suppress, the satisfaction of a symmetry that feels like justice. What I actually felt was more complicated and less comfortable than triumph. It felt like confirmation, like the land had said something that had been building for a very long time and had finally said it in terms that could not be argued with or bought out or persuaded away. Within a month, Adelaide had sold the ranch. The sale was handled quietly, a buyer from the coast who wanted land for cattle and didn't know or care about the water history. Adelaide took what the sale brought her and left the valley. She went, I heard later, to relatives in California. She left on a morning when the water was running from the hollow in the steady, indifferent way it always ran, and no one stood at the road to watch her go, and the valley did not mark her departure with any particular ceremony. She had come here with her father's name and her father's wells and her father's arrangement of the world. She left with none of those things, just herself and what she carried, which included, I thought, the knowledge of what she had known and chosen not to act on. That knowledge would go with her wherever she went. It was hers to carry. I did not envy her the weight of it. Amos Crowfoot died in the winter of that year. December in the hills above the valley, peacefully in his sleep at the age of 94. The people of his community who brought me the news said he had been well, that last week had eaten his meals and spoken with the people around him and sat in the afternoon sun on the south-facing rock near his dwelling where he liked to sit. They said he had seemed in his last days content in a way that was different from his ordinary contentment. Satisfied, perhaps, as though something long pending had been completed. I understood this. We buried him, the people of his community, and I with Clem present, and a few others from the valley who had known him on the hillside above the hollow. It was his request apparently communicated to the people who knew his wishes. He wanted to be on the hillside above the tunnel entrance, where he could look down at the hollow and the flow of water running out of it and down toward the valley. The stone we set at the head of his grave was a flat piece of the same formation rock as the mesa, the right color, the right weight, the right density. We carved it as cleanly as we could manage. It said, he taught her to listen. I stood at the grave for a long time after the others had gone, with the December cold in the air and the sound of the water below flowing at 55 degrees and completely indifferent to winter, to parallel, to the human events taking place on the surface above it. I thought about an old man sitting at the entrance to a hollow for 3 years once a month, waiting for news of a tunnel and offering what he knew when it was needed and nothing when it wasn't. I thought about a 58-year-old man standing on a hillside in 1855, watching something happen that he could not stop. I thought about 32 years of holding a map in his memory because the paper had been taken and the memory was all that remained. He had known Ruth Vance for 3 years and held what she had taught him for 4 decades more. He had waited on a hillside above an abandoned hollow for someone to come back and be worth the waiting. I hoped the waiting had been worth it. I thought from the look on his face in those last months, the settled, satisfied quality that the people of his community had described that it had been. I said goodbye to him in the same way I had said goodbye to Ruth, which was by speaking into the cold December air to someone I could not see and trusting that the words went somewhere. Then I walked back down to the valley. I am 71 years old. It is 1940 and I am sitting on the porch of the same adobe house that my parents built and that my grandmother lived in before them, the same house where I found the wooden box behind the plaster wall, the same house where Pharaoh sat at my kitchen table with his briefcase open. The house has been repaired and expanded over 50 years, and it does not look the same as it did, but it sits on the same ground and it faces the same East Mesa, and the hollow is still there in the shadow of the rock face, with the water still running out of it, the same flow it has always been. 50 years. The valley is different from what it was. Not unrecognizably different. The land is still the land. The desert is still the desert. The wash still runs for 8 weeks in monsoon season and sits dry the rest of the year. But there are more people because there is water. The properties that had failed in the drought years were reestablished. New families came. Bright Creek became a town with more than 8 buildings on its main street, which is a modest success by most measures, but a considerable achievement by the standards of a place that had been emptying. The hollow has been formalized. A county engineer came out in 1895 and confirmed what Ruth had calculated, and I had confirmed by doing it that the water was connected to a deep aquifer system that extended across a significant portion of the territory and showed no signs of depletion. The flow was measured and assessed and found consistent with 55 degrees year-round and a volume adequate for the valley's needs with room to spare. The water that runs from the hollow is used by everyone in the valley. It is not sold. There is a county administration that maintains the distribution infrastructure and charges a maintenance fee that is proportional to use and set by the county board, which includes representatives of every family that draws from the system. The fee pays for pipes and maintenance. It does not pay for the water. The water is not for sale. I had a hand in writing that provision into the county charter in 1897. I am not a lawyer, but I can read, and I read everything relevant before I sat down with the county commissioners. The water rights provisions in the charter are, in my judgment, the most important thing I have ever written. Clem Drummond and I married in 1893. He died in 1931 of a heart failure that came without warning on a Tuesday afternoon in July, which was the kind of death he would have chosen if he had been given a choice quick, not preceded by a long decline during the working day, rather than at the end of it. We had 38 years together, 2 children, 4 grandchildren. The oldest grandchild, a girl of 11, with her mother's patience and her grandfather's hands, is the one who traced the scars on my palms and asked me how I got them, and was satisfied with the answer I gave her. I still have Ruth's journals. They are on the shelf in the back room, the same shelf I found them on the wooden box they came in, replaced with a proper archival case that the library in Tucson helped me acquire. They are more fragile than they were. Paper has a finite life, and Ruth's paper is nearly 90 years old, but they are legible and they are complete, and I have arranged for them to be donated to the county historical collection when I am gone, so that whoever wants to understand what happened here can read it in her words rather than mine. On the shelf beside the journals is her pickaxe head. The iron one I found in the darkness at 310 feet, the one that had been grating against the floor of my grandmother's tunnel since 1855. I cleaned it when I brought it out of the tunnel and found that the iron was sound underneath the rust. Good Pennsylvania iron properly made, built to outlast the person who used it by a considerable margin, which it had done. It sits in a simple wooden mount that Clem made for it on the shelf where I can see it from the kitchen table. My granddaughter asked me about it once. I told her it belonged to my grandmother. She asked if it was old. I told her it was from 1851 at the latest, which made it nearly 90 years old, the same age as the journals. She turned it over in her hands with the careful attention of a child handling something that deserves care, and then she set it back in its mount and went on to the next thing, which is what children do and what I did at her age, and which seems correct. The water runs. Not because of anything I did this morning or anything I did last week. It runs because of what the earth does at depth, what it has always done, the constant temperature and the constant pressure and the constant movement through stone that has been occurring since before there were people to notice or measure it. It runs because Ruth found it and because Amos understood it and because I dug the passage that let it out. It runs because 3 women paid attention to the same thing across 50 years, and the paying of attention eventually has consequences. I went down to the hollow this morning as I do most mornings. The walk is slower than it used to be, and the hollow looks different when you approach it at 71 than it looked when you approached it at 18 with a pickaxe on your shoulder and everything still undecided. But the air is the same. 55 degrees coming out of the tunnel entrance and rising unmistakable if you know what you are feeling for, invisible if you don't. I stood at the entrance for a while. Then I went in. Not to the end, I don't do that anymore, and the tunnel has been modified over the years for proper water management in ways that would make the original unrecognizable. But far enough to be inside the mesa, far enough to feel the temperature stabilize around me, and hear the water running somewhere below, the same sound I heard for the first time in February of 1890, when I pressed my ear to the wall and understood that Ruth had been right. The water runs. I came back out into the morning into the Arizona light, and I stood at the hollow entrance and looked out at the valley. Green in places it was not green when I was young. Houses where there were empty foundations. Children who have never had a day of their lives shaped by the specific fear of a valley without water. I thought about my grandmother. I thought about what it cost her and what she gave us. The years of work and the years of silence and the map hidden in the wall and the pickaxe head in the rock and the journal entry pressed down at the period as though she were trying to drive the period into the stone itself, as though the ending of the writing could stand in for everything she could not say. I thought about what it means to begin something you cannot finish. to do the work anyway, to leave what you have found in a form that someone who comes after you can use. I did not find the water. Ruth found the water. She found it in 1853, standing in this hollow with her hand on this rock, feeling 55 degrees rising out of the ground on the hottest day of an Arizona summer. She found it and she could not reach it, and she spent the rest of her life making sure that the finding was not lost. I dug the last few feet for her. I held the pickaxe she had left in the rock, and I struck the final blows, and I ran out of the tunnel in the dark with cold water at my chest. That was my part. It was not the whole story. It was not even most of the story. The water has been flowing for 50 years. Grandmother Ruth found it. I only dug the last few feet for her. That's all I did.